good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I'm Terry Townsend, a fellow of the Paulson Institute, and I'd like to welcome you all to this special Paulson Institute webinar dedicated to valuing nature and looking at biodiversity in the post-COVID world. The observant will notice that I'm not Deborah Lair as advertised. Deborah's currently battening down the hatches in the Caribbean as Hurricane Isaiah makes landfall. So she's asked me to step in to moderate this panel. We wish her and her family all the best as the storm passes. So first of all, a few housekeeping notes before we begin. I'd like to ask the speakers to remain on mute when not in the hot seat. And I'd like to remind all of you listening around the world that we're very excited to have your participation today. And we invite you to send us your questions as you hear the discussions through the chat function at the bottom of the screen. And we'll aim to get to as many of those as possible in the Q&A session after the initial discussion. But before I introduce our panel, I wanted to just say a few sentences to set the scene. So recent research from the World Economic Forum has shown that about 44 trillion of global GDP, which is around half, depends either heavily or moderately on nature. And yet in 2019, the total biodiversity financing was estimated to be around 124 to 143 billion dollars, which corresponds to around 0.14% of global GDP. So historically, natural resources have been so abundant and the services nature provides so reliable that we have gone down a path of taking nature for granted and over-exploiting natural resources. And this abuse of nature is there for all to see. In the last 4 decades, the populations of mammals, birds and reptiles on Earth has fallen by an average of around 60%. And tropical forests, the greatest source of biodiversity on Earth, are in retreat around the world. The extinction rate of species is estimated to be around 1,000 times the natural rate. And as biodiversity loss accelerates, we're realizing that with this loss comes serious risks to human well-being. Some of those risks are broadly known. For example, the potential economic cost of losing our pollinators, our insects and other pollinators, the cost of losing carbon storage from trees due to deforestation, and front and center right now, of course, are the health risks associated with zoonotic diseases such as COVID-19. However, due to the complexity of nature and the interdependencies, there are many unknown risks of biodiversity loss. And together, these risks, both known and unknown, are likely to be of a magnitude that dwarf the current COVID-19 crisis. And when facing risks of a large magnitude, we tend to take out insurance policies to manage that risk. And knowing what we know now, it's surely time for us to invest in nature, to insure against the risks that we know are coming. Next year, governments will meet in Kunming, China, at the 15th Conference of the Parties to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. And they're scheduled to agree on a new deal for nature, including targets to halt and reverse biodiversity loss to 2030 and beyond. And this is an important step, but given that the public sector will not be able to generate anywhere near the finance required to protect our most important biodiversity and the ecosystem services that they provide, much more will be needed. And how we ensure we spend enough to protect our environment and biodiversity is at the heart of this discussion today. So now, without further ado, I'm honoured to introduce our esteemed panel, who I know will provide some different but very valuable perspectives on this important topic. So in alphabetical order, first we have Honourable Barry Gardiner, MP, who's a Member of Parliament for Brent North in London and has been since 1997. He served as a minister in Tony Blair's UK government in 3 different departments, Northern Ireland, Trade and Industry, and Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, where he became the world's first Minister for Biodiversity. Second, we have Professor Jeffrey Heal, a renowned authority on environmental and resource economics and economic theory. And Jeff is a professor at the Columbia Business School. The third, my colleague Rose New, the Paulson Institute's Chief Conservation Officer. Rose manages initiatives to protect globally significant biodiversity and ecosystems and to promote sustainable management of natural resources. And finally, to complete the panel, we have Simon Sadek, who is Chair of Finance for Biodiversity, a pop-up research, advocacy and grant-making platform focused on making biodiversity relevant to financial decision-making. So a warm welcome to all of you. And to get us started, I just wanted to ask a couple of broad questions to shape the conversation. And I will invite each of you in turn to provide your initial thoughts and insights into this discussion. And then we'll open it up to questions from the audience around the world. Okay, so the two questions. First, what has the COVID-19 pandemic and the international community's response taught us about the human relationship with nature, the risks we're facing, and the need to value nature more appropriately in our economies? And the second question, if you were president or prime minister of your country right now, what is the first step you would take towards ensuring your country against the risks associated with biodiversity loss? So two big questions there. And to kick off, we'll go in alphabetical order again. So to Barry Gardiner, over to you.
Terry, thanks very much. So what has the pandemic taught us? Three things. Whatever we do for nature, we do for ourselves. And whatever we do to nature, we do to ourselves. So protect nature and we protect ourselves. If nature is resilient, then we are. If nature's busted, then so are we. And what that means in the words of a recent article in Nature is this: biodiversity loss tends to increase pathogen transmission and disease incidence. And that's what we've seen with COVID-19. The second point, we stand and fall as a human species together. The natural environment is no respecter of national boundaries, and I'm afraid protectionism is just not possible at a natural level. Fish swim, birds fly, viruses travel first class on airplanes, and none of them carry passports. Third, today, for the first time, we know the exact value that the world puts on biodiversity. To be specific, the life of a single dead microbe is $2.7 billion. Because yesterday, we launched Operation Perseverance in our quest to find life on Mars. Now, imagine if we valued life on Earth that much. The cost of COVID to the global community is 3.8 trillion, or 5.4 trillion, or 8.8 trillion, or pick a number and then admit that nobody knows, because those are just the figures that I found on Google this morning. Now, imagine trying to calculate the value of the biodiversity that we have lost, and then think of that amazing library in Alexandria in the ancient world that was burnt to the ground. The works of Homer, Sophocles, the works of Plato and Socrates, the ones that we never read, the ones that we never knew. That's the loss of biodiversity that we've experienced already. But valuing nature and biodiversity isn't just an economic challenge, it's a political one, because single country responses just don't fit. We might decide in the UK to fish at maximum sustainable yield. But if our neighbor across the channel decides to vacuum up as much biomass as possible, then we're not going to be able to restore the health of our oceans. And Terry, you asked about the risks that we're facing in our human relationship with nature. We have to understand that COVID, it's not even a dress rehearsal. We are facing a combined climate and environmental emergency, and it's coming at us not just at speed, but with unpredictable speed, because there are trigger points, there are feedback loops where natural systems simply collapse. They don't degrade progressively to zero. And that indeterminacy means that a traditional linear response is simply not good enough. So we have to build back better. People talk as if there's a choice between an economic recovery and a sustainable green recovery. The truth is, unless it is a sustainable green recovery, then it's not a recovery. Your second question, if I were Prime Minister right now, what would be the first thing I would do to ensure the country against risks associated with biodiversity loss? Okay, again, 3 points. Find out what you've got. You can't value what you don't know about. And when I was Minister for Biodiversity, I started the process that led to the first National Ecosystem Assessment. Now, in the UK, we're very lucky. We have a long history of citizen science that has logged the natural world. In fact, last weekend, we had our big butterfly count. And it's quite incredible. More than 110,000 of us sat for 15 minutes a session and logged the butterflies that we saw. That's not just important data. It increases awareness and it educates the population. And of course, that is one of the Aichi Target's strategic goals. So second point, end subsidies. Stop paying people for damaging our natural ecosystems. Let's face it, if Larry Fink and BlackRock have stopped investing in them because they see the risk of stranded assets from fossil fuels, then we should probably stop pouring public money into the destruction of public goods like clean air and a stable climate. And to do that, you need to stop seeing GDP as the key measure of your country's well-being. It's not. Third, set clear and ambitious targets for the improvements in ecosystems and the natural world that you want to see. It doesn't matter if it's waste reduction, improvement of soil quality, restoration of habitat. Targets drive performance. And if, like Norway, you announce to the world that by 2025, that'll be the last date for the sale of cars powered by fossil fuel, then you incentivize Volvo to end petrol-only production by 2019, which it's done, and launch 3 new fully electric vehicles by 2021. But I want to set a caution against targets that aren't based on data. When I first became Minister in the Department of Environment, the first thing my civil servants talked to me about was the 2010 Biodiversity Target. And I asked them, okay, what's the target? And they said, oh, Minister, we're going to halve the rate of species loss by 2010. And I said, oh, that's great. And what was the rate of species loss when you set the target in 2003? Awful silence descended upon the room. They didn't know. They hadn't got a baseline. They hadn't got the data. And without that, the target was meaningless. So targets have to be based on sound data. They have to be clear enough and strong enough to drive change now, because a target in 20 years' time isn't a target. It's somebody else's problem. So by all means, have long-term goals, but make sure that you have interim targets that are independently monitored. Those would be my initial responses.
I think we've temporarily lost.
Have we lost Terry?
Oh, I'm back.
He's back.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hey, that's the first
Great,
time I've
I'm
ever
back.
made you lost for words.
Yeah. Yes. But suddenly my internet connection went. That's China for you. I apologize, but it came back pretty quick. I think that's a great start, Barry. Thank you very much for that. And I'd love to come back to a couple of the points later on in the discussion. But I think that's a wonderful start to kick us off. So next we'll go straight to Professor Heal. Jeff.
Thanks. Well, thanks for those remarks, Barry. I think those were really great remarks. I absolutely agree with everything you said, and I don't think anybody could have said it better. That was a wonderful start to the proceedings. Let me add some things. So what have we learnt from COVID-19? One of the things we've learnt is that the risks we face when our relationship with nature goes wrong are absolutely huge. Basically, COVID-19 will have closed down a large part of the world's economy for little short of a year, maybe even more than a year by the time we've got vaccines in place. I think 5 years back, it would have been very difficult for most people to imagine that a naturally occurring phenomenon, a simple naturally occurring phenomenon like the release of a microbe, could close down most of the world economy for 6, 9 months, 12 months, maybe even more than that. So the risks we face in not managing our relationship with nature properly are absolutely huge, really are huge. I mean, the cost of this will be massive, both in terms of dollars, and many, many trillions of dollars, obviously, but also in terms of human lives. Millions of people will have died by the end of this. So take these risks very, very seriously. And a related point, obviously, is I very much hope, though I'm not totally confident of this, that the experience of COVID-19 will lead the world to take scientific advice much more seriously. Scientists have been warning about the impending possibility of a pandemic for a long time now. And these warnings, we started really noticing zoonotic diseases back with the incidence of AIDS. AIDS is probably the first of the modern zoonotic pandemics to hit the modern world. And that obviously has had a huge impact on society. And ever since then, scientists have been warning that there are many more zoonotic diseases waiting to hit society. And finally, we've got another one. But there are many more out there. This could happen many times over. There's nothing particularly unique about the set of circumstances, I think, that gave rise to COVID-19. So we have to be very careful about that. And I think that both Terry and Barry hinted, there's a lot of evidence now that the destruction of biodiversity, the destruction of tropical forests, the destruction of natural habitats is a major contributor to the release of zoonotic diseases. So we are storing up trouble for ourselves by cutting down tropical forests. So that's my remarks on what we might have learned, hopefully have learned from COVID-19. I actually haven't really thought an awful lot about what I would do if I'm Prime Minister. That's not exactly my line of business, more Barry's than mine, I think. But let me take a shot at that anyway. One of the things I would do is press very hard on climate change, because one of the biggest threats to biodiversity is climate change. The climate change is destroying tropical forests. It's destroying habitats, changing habitats, threatening many, many species. So I think that action on climate change is very important, and it's to use a very non-ecological metaphor, it kills two birds with one stone. It tackles climate change itself, but it also tackles the issue of biodiversity. And incidentally, one of the best ways of tackling climate change is to conserve tropical forests. Tropical forests take a huge amount of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and they store it out of harm's way in the soil, in the wooden trunks. So if we can really provide good incentives to conserving tropical forests, we can both tackle climate change and tackle biodiversity loss, because obviously, as everybody knows, a large fraction of the world's biodiversity lives in tropical forests. But also the other obvious moves for tackling climate change: green energy, electric vehicles, and of course, as Barry said, stop subsidizing the use of fossil fuels, for God's sake. I actually wrote a piece recently on the extent of the world's subsidies to fossil fuels, and it was quite staggering. I mean, here in the US, the average family subsidizes fossil fuels to the extent of about $6,000 a year through various tax subsidies. It's quite ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. Many, many times the subsidies that go to renewable energy. So that's one thing I do. The other thing I do, which is slightly different, is I would I'd like to make certain that people really understand the importance of biodiversity. I don't think it's widely enough understood. And I'm sure the people here understand the importance of biodiversity, people on this webinar do, but the public as a whole doesn't. The public as a whole, I think, still thinks of biodiversity in terms of cute animals, charismatic animals, and if you tell them these things are going extinct, they say how terrible, what a shame, but they don't see it as a threat to themselves. And Barry started off by emphasizing just how important loss of biodiversity is in terms of a threat to us. And I'd like to see that point really driven home much harder. I'd like to see a situation where the public doesn't think of biodiversity loss in terms of David Attenborough type programs, though those are great, obviously, but thinks of biodiversity loss in terms of a threat to their livelihoods, a threat to their health. And it's important for people to realize that maybe a third of all the medicines currently in widespread use were derived from biodiversity. And to realize that a third of all of our food requires pollination. These are really critical things. We could lose a lot of our food, we could lose a lot of our medicines, of potential future medicines, if we don't attend to the destruction of biodiversity. So that's the other point I'd like to emphasize, apart from the importance of climate change. Thanks. We seem to have lost Terry totally.
I think, Jeff, we're self-moderating now.
Yeah,
So it's no bad thing. Shall we go straight to Rose?
I think so.
Okay, I apologize for these technical difficulties, and it's my great pleasure and honor to be with this group of very distinguished experts. Since I'm the only non-native English speaker, I will, I hope you can excuse me for some of my maybe not so smooth comments about those questions. I think first of all, we need to recognize a very sobering fact that the Earth is experiencing dramatic and accelerating biodiversity caused by human activities over the last 50 years. The rapid biodiversity loss has been undermining nature's ability to provide ecological services on which we whole human society depends on. It presents enormous risk to our well-being and also prosperity. Welcome back, Terry. We already started. So based on scientific evidence, there is very little doubt that humans' overexploitation of nature has played a role in outbreak of zoonotic diseases, as Professor Hill pointed out. It is not a coincidence that during this time of rapid global diversity loss, we have also seen multiple outbreaks of zoonotic diseases, such as SARS, Ebola, MERS, and of course the COVID-19 pandemic. This pandemic should be a wake-up call for all of us to rethink our attitude towards nature and how we can rebuild healthier relationship with nature. I come from a minority ethnic group in China called Naxi. In our traditional culture, we believe that both human and wildlife are children of Mother Nature. So we should treat other wildlife like our sisters and brothers. Unfortunately, most of those traditional cultures are lost now. Felicia, please put up these slides. I gave it to you. If we look at the response of global community towards the COVID-19 pandemic, the result has been very mixed. The fiscal responses was swift and unprecedented in scale in mitigating the impact of biggest shock to the global economy since the Great Depression. So far, from the information we got, the total amount of the stimulus plan announced by governments has increased to 11.8 trillion globally. However, the majority of the global economic response is set to reinforce the trend of global biodiversity loss. From these slides, we can see from screen, the green stimulus index of 17 major economies of the world developed by Vivid Economics. Most governments has not chosen to use economic stimulus to enhance nature or tackle climate change. We can see most of the countries only allocate very small portion of the stimulus funds to the sectors and projects that support conservation of nature. a lot of funds support environmentally harmful industries are in the form of unconditional bailouts simply. Fortunately, we see some good examples set by European countries. For example, EU has approved the next generation EU recovery package, which includes substantial funding for green initiatives. Economic specific announcements include Germany's substantially green-oriented package for the future and support for South Korea's Green New Deal. France has achieved more success in attaching environmental conditions to bailouts granted to environmentally harmful industries. UK has also announced some specific funding for green projects. Apart from immeasurable cultural and spiritual value, nature has tremendous economic value, providing a range of ecosystem services. Those services include fertile soil and pollination that make food production possible, forest and watershed that store carbon and purify water, the genetic diversity which much of modern pharmaceutical industry and agriculture depends on. Even if we are only beginning to understand the magnitude of the risk of losing those services, we already know the stake is very high and the consequences are unbearable. Let's look at the risk of potential worldwide loss of pollinators, such as bees, butterflies, moths, and other insects due to our excessive use of pesticides. According to research, such a loss would lead to an estimated drop in annual agriculture output worth $217 billion. More importantly, associated with this loss is the risk of famine and social unrest. Another example of the risk is more frequent outbreak of zoonotic pandemics if we continue to trade and consume wildlife and convert wildlife habitat to farmlands and cities. We know the price we have to pay is losing a lot of human lives and more serious global economic pandemic. Natural capital is complex and difficult to measure. Financial market does not recognize the value of natural capital unless it has defined cash flows or asset values that can be measured and recognized by current economic system. The current failure of our market, financial market and economic system correctly value biodiversity lies at the intersect of several market failures due to externality of public goods and also lacking of well-defined property right of environment products and services, as pointed by Professor Hill's article written for our report. Therefore, we cannot rely on market force alone to solve the problem of biodiversity loss. Government policy intervention is essential to fix those market failures. We should also realize the transformational change in the way markets and other economic systems value nature is not going to happen overnight and will require compelling economic case championed by strong political leaders and broad public support. In the middle of September this year, the Paulson Institute, together with our partner, will launch a major new report on financing nature, making the economic case for value nature and providing a set of recommendations for how to develop and implement financing and policy mechanisms that can reduce negative impacts on biodiversity and mobilize substantial amount of capital for global biodiversity conservation. Human health and other well-being rely on a healthy planet. Government has a responsibility to ensure short-term emergency measures lead to better and more resilient future. We should learn from those countries that have taken the lead on green recovery from the current pandemic, and then act decisively to prevent irreversible damage to our planet. If I was the president of China, I would mainstream the principle of ecological civilization into all major economic sectors and institutions. I would strengthen China's protected area system, including establishing more and new national parks. I would not simply view government spending on conservation merely as cost or budgetary burden. Through proper policy design and mechanisms, protected area actually can contribute to broader national economy significantly. Good example actually is the US National Park System. In 2019, visitors spending in communities near national parks resulted in $41 billion benefit to the US economy and supported 340,000 jobs. And in contrast, the congressional appropriation for the US National Park System is just around $3.2 billion. So we know how to calculate the benefit and cost of this investment. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Rose. I thought that graphic on the stimulus was quite revealing, and if a little disappointing in terms of how much governments are focusing on green elements to those stimulus packages, and that's something I think we can talk a bit more about later. Sorry, I disappeared again. Back again. Now to the final panelists, Simon, Sadek. Really looking forward to listening to your contribution. So over to you.
Thanks very much indeed. And thanks to all of you for crowding out many of the things that I might have said by saying them already and very eloquently. So let me start with the first question about COVID, nature, and people. What have we learned? Perhaps I'm going to approach this in a slightly different way. I think we've learned 4 things so far, and the jury is still out. Firstly, we've learned that we can change. That in the space of 100 days, we changed significantly the way the world worked. And that is the first time, certainly in my life, that that has happened. And it is a rare occurrence outside of the context of war. But secondly, we've equally found that stickiness is a very difficult thing. That as lockdowns have begun to be eased, people have returned to their old habits. And we know a lot from behavioral economics and many other disciplines that holding people into new patterns of behavior, even when they've experienced it intensely, albeit for short periods of time, is a very challenging thing to do. So we can change, but stickiness is tough. Number 2, perhaps a piece of bad news, is that fear drives change more quickly often than what we would consider to be positive values. Actually, our fear of climate has no equivalent of our love of climate. But fear about zoonotics and pandemics has an opposite in the context of nature, which is we can love it, we can embrace it, we can be part of it. And yet it's clear that we rarely respond to those positive signals. The truth is that the pandemic shows us that we respond to fear far more quickly and ably than we respond to the things that we value most, a rather sad occurrence. The third thing that we have learned profoundly from this current period is that our discount rate is very high. So we're willing to spend perhaps $10 trillion on dealing with an immediate pandemic, as well as $10 trillion plus in loss of GDP, but we're not willing to spend a couple of $1 trillion to try and address the climate challenge for our children and grandchildren. That actually, we've spent that money to save people like me, old people who are vulnerable. We haven't really spent that money to save people who will inherit the world going forward. Yeah, so our discount rate is high, and that is a problem if we want to address nature challenges outside of crises such as the pandemic. And then the fourth and related issue that I would raise in the context of our learning now is that the question of solidarity is an open question. We have seen the pandemic generate the most extraordinary passion and engagement from individuals and families and communities and neighbors in the way in which they have helped each other. And in the main, we've seen exactly the opposite when we've witnessed how countries have opposed each other, have ignored each other, have accused each other, rather than joining together to fix problems. We've seen the Black Lives Matter movement emerge out of the pandemic, a very important phenomena that we shouldn't set to one side, not simply because Black Lives Matter, but because the relationship between crisis and solidarity is very important. But I don't think we've seen play out the implications of the pandemic for the intergenerational compact, which is perhaps the single most important compact of all. As the lockdown eases, we witness many young people really showing a complete disinterest in the vulnerability of older people to the virus. And in many ways, that is understandable. So I think there are deep learnings, of which I've been very superficial, emerging that help us think about how we manage our collective relationship to nature and the role of crises and the role of non-crises, or crises that have not yet become apparent, such as climate in many respects, going forward. Now I'd like to turn to the second question that has been addressed, which is, what would we do? Now, Rose, you've stolen my thunder. So the Green Stimulus Index was undertaken by Vivid, as you say, but in fact was commissioned and built out by Finance for Biodiversity. And actually, you haven't really stolen my thunder at all. You've just given me an opportunity to add a little bit more.
That's great.
That the Green Stimulus Index, of which there are now 4 iterations, is progressively, increasingly becoming more sophisticated in analyzing the extent to which nature is being addressed through stimulus programs. And the importance of that is to actually get beyond that broad notion of green, which embodies so many different, slightly fudgy ideas. And if one looks at the documentation, the technical analysis sitting within it, we've begun to really separate out broader green issues from climate issues, and we're beginning to see really what the nature piece of the story looks like. We've also built out a number of supplementary documents that look at the question of the employment effects of addressing nature through stimulus programs, and really put to bed the argument that we can deal with the big problems after the crisis is over, where it's absolutely clear that this extraordinary tsunami of money can be used effectively to address the long-term problems at the same time as addressing the short-term crisis. The Green Stimulus Index we will continue to work on and continue not only to produce new technical iterations, but we're using it as an engagement and advocacy tool. Why doesn't the European Commission adopt it for its 27 countries? Why doesn't the World Bank adopt it in looking at the way in which it works with its many different member states? Why doesn't the UN adopt it and really bring it to the forefront in its biodiversity conference at the end of September in the context of the UN General Assembly? Why doesn't China adopt it and apply it to its different provinces, or Germany to its different states? Actually, my point is not that this tool is perfect. My point is that this tool is needed, and it helps us understand where to allocate this extraordinary amount of money that we will need to pay back. This is not free money, let no one fool you. So we might as well put it to good use. My second example, if I may give one more, since Rose, you stole at least part of mine, regards another piece of work that Finance for Biodiversity is taking forward. Now, in the forefront on every newspaper is the green stimulus and recovery and unemployment, and quite rightly so. But in the background, we have a different kind of crisis emerging, which is a crisis of sovereign debt for emerging and developing countries. Over the last 10 years, the sovereign debt of emerging markets has risen from 60% to 170% of GDP overall. So an extraordinary increase, largely driven by the cheap capital delivered by quantitative easing that was meant to get us out of the last crisis that we had in 2008 and 9. Well, now the chips are up. For many of those countries, their economies are imploding, their tax receipts are through the floor, their employment levels and poverty levels are going up to extraordinary levels, and more debt is needed and debt can't be repaid. We have an emerging market debt crisis of extraordinary proportions emerging, and it has real implications, frankly, not just for nature, but to the lives of tens, if not hundreds of millions of people in Bangladesh and elsewhere. Those of you who are reading what is going on in Bangladesh at the moment, part of that, not the hurricanes and floods themselves, is to do with the complete devastation of the public service system in the context of the pandemic. So the difficulty of responding to floods, which actually historically Bangladesh has been very good at dealing with. We believe that sovereign debt markets should have natural capital balance sheets. After all, who would lend money to a company that didn't have a balance sheet? So why do we have sovereign debt markets of $40, $50 trillion with absolutely no balance sheets at all? We believe that the sovereign debt crisis associated with the pandemic provides an opportunity to bring natural capital firmly into the process of sovereign debt restructuring, to bring natural capital in as an asset onto balance sheets and build a new class of sovereign debt instruments that deliver reduced cost of capital, lower principal repayments in return for nature uplifts. Clearly, those most interested on the creditor side will be countries with an interest in biodiversity inherently and who can afford to pay for it. For example, the UK, France, Germany, and others that are interested and are strong official creditors of sovereign debt. But we also believe that this can be tuned into liquidity within private capital markets, and we've seen organizations like Nature Conservancy manage that on a one-off basis for particular bonds over the past years very effectively. Last comment, and then I'll hand back to you since you're here and your internet seems to be working well. I said the story that we can't solve the real problem until we've overcome the crisis is something that we hear every day here. It's something that we've heard every day for the last 10 years, and we have to bury it forever. We have to show, and we don't have to prove it anymore. The data is there, that actually we must solve the nature crisis as well as the climate crisis, and we can use the extraordinary situation of today's pandemic-related crisis to do exactly that. In fact, to illustrate the point, the green stimulus index actually can become an index that measures all of government's public expenditure, not simply at the moment of a stimulus needed. It can translate into a long-term play that measures, that holds to account governments in the way in which they spend to a total of 40% of the global economy and ensure that nature and climate considerations are taken into account. Similarly, on the debt side, we can use the emerging market debt crisis to bring natural capital into some new sovereign debt bonds that help emerging markets reduce the cost of capital and deliver nature performance upsides. But actually, we can use that for a long-term play that brings natural capital properly into sovereign debt markets across the entire sweep of the $40 to $50 trillion of debt that are out there going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. I think you've introduced some really important issues there, particularly around sovereign debt and Also, this narrative about having to solve the immediate crisis first before we focus on anything else. I think you're absolutely right with that. Okay, I want to give the panel an opportunity just to respond to the interventions that we've had to each other's for a few minutes before we go on to questions. So, would any of you like to respond to? Maybe Barry can respond to the point that Simon about sovereign debt. Is that something that you can give us an insight, a political insight on?
I was writing furiously when Simon was speaking and taking note of it all. Thank you very much, and really, really thought-provoking. There is clearly the sovereign debt crisis that you spoke of. What I want to maybe tease out from you is how you see governments who would be creditors utilizing the concept of natural capital in the debtor countries as a way of securing their loans. What ultimately are they going to see as the return on that? How are they going to quantify it? And this is the political problem. I'm not saying it's a financial problem or rather an economic problem ultimately, but the political problem is selling that politically to people who are looking for short-term return. And I don't just mean market return, I'm talking about the politicians who need to be able to show to their public in a very short window frame, 3 to 5 years, that they are actually delivering in a way that their public will re-elect them. So it's a traditional problem of both politicians and investors. We have very short horizons, but I wonder how you see the structure that you set out overcoming that.
So I would suggest, Barry, first of all, that I give a short answer, but I suspect a longer discussion between you and me is to come. Not least because we're in discussion with the UK government, including both DEFRA, DFID and Treasury on exactly this issue. So that's a conversation I hope I can have going forward, and indeed to secure your support in the work. But let me try and just give a sort of compacted, non-technical answer to your question. We believe, first of all, that there are today a small number of government creditors of sovereign debt who would like to be seen as buying down natural capital externalities, so improving natural capital outcomes. Those that are focused on CBD, those that are focused on COP, the climate negotiations, those that are about to acquire the presidency of the G20, which is Italy, and those that are about to acquire the presidency of the G7, which is the UK. Obviously, the outcome of the elections in the US will make a significant difference to the G7 and G20 platforms, but that won't prevent action happening at the bilateral level. Yeah, and we've seen historically France doing debt for nature swaps with Gambia, and many other examples of where, if you like, the creditor country has an interest. On the other hand, we think there are probably other creditors on the government side who perhaps are less interested in this point. Perhaps Arab states may be a case in point, although I apologize if that's completely wrong. But certainly there are some countries or some governments that will see a political alignment right now in wanting to take that forward, and others who won't. I also think as they face demands for debt relief, which of course are now rapidly coming from the Pope, from the UN Secretary General, and from many campaigning organizations, it is an interesting opportunity to explore whether a debt restructuring that brings natural capital into sovereign debt markets offers a more exciting future prospect with equivalent short-term gains than debt relief. Because debt relief in any case will lead to a haircut on the part of those governments who are holding the debt. But if actually we can build in a new asset class of nature performance bonds at the same time, then the downside finance actually is less or equivalent with an upside interest not only in direct nature returns, but in really bringing change or seeking to bring change in this huge swath, this huge part of the way in which the global financial system works.
If I may, I get that. It's an expansion, if you like, of the bilateral debt for nature swaps. What I think, when you say that there's a return, there's an upside the question is who benefits from the upside? And you know that certainly in the UK, and I believe probably also in the US, there is a huge agenda against international aid. And this seems to me to be a political target that those who would love to be attacking international aid would also seek to attack. So what I'm trying to tease out, in effect, is the political problems with explaining to people that what I said at the beginning, what was it? We stand or fall as the human species together. And the idea that you know, improvements in biodiversity and the natural environment and ecosystem services somewhere in the globe is not of benefit to all of us is simply wrong. It's a miscalculation, but persuading people that it's the correct calculation when they're not going to see the immediate and direct benefits, I think is a real political problem that certainly I as a politician face.
So perhaps let me just say, I agree for continued discussion, because you're absolutely right. For discussion, and I'm sure help from you, Barry, and I'm sure that there are other kind of questions and issues that people would like to bring to the table.
Yeah. Thank you. I can see that you two are going to get on like a house on fire, and I think we've made a connection there that's going to lead to many great and wonderful things on this agenda. But I just wanted to make sure that we did address a few questions that have been put forward by the listeners around the world. And the first one I wanted to address to Jeff is we have a question here from Eric Hammond, who says, consumption is the driver of all these problems. That's been tied to population. And while there is a link, poverty is a greater issue. How can consumption be a driver of increased biodiversity? That's an easy one for you.
Yes, absolutely. Clearly, we need to change our consumption patterns. So one of the biggest drivers of biodiversity loss is actually farming for beef. And beef is eating cattle is a very, very inefficient way of getting protein, I regret to say. It uses a huge amount of water, huge amount of land. It's a big driver of deforestation in many tropical and subtropical countries. Changing our diet can make a big impact on how destructive our consumption is. So if we could change our diets, we could all be perfectly well fed with significantly less environmental impact. And one of the things I find very interesting actually here in the US in particular has been the sort of fairly rapid growth of vegetarian or vegan diets amongst younger people, amongst millennials in particular in the US, and the enormous success of a couple of meat substitute producers, Beyond Beef and Impossible Foods. Beyond Beef and Impossible Foods produce substitutes for beef, which have actually been selling very, very well indeed in the US. I mean, the share price of Beyond Beef has risen enormously since they were floated less than a year ago, actually. And they're operating at absolutely full capacity all the time. All of the main supermarkets now sell their products. And you can see a real possibility of people developing a diet which is less intensive in beef and therefore less intensive in its environmental impact. Again, another way we can change our pattern of consumption to reduce environmental impact is just to drive electric vehicles rather than internal combustion engines. Much less pollution, much less impact on the climate, much less habitat destruction, particularly if we're using energy to charge them, which comes from renewable sources. And I'd just like to make one quick comment about the discussion between Simon and Barry. I think that very interesting discussion, fascinating. We could have an entire webinar on that topic alone. I suggest it'd be nice if you thought about cap and trade. I mean, one of the big issues here is monetizing these benefits. One of the strange things that cap and trade does is to monetize benefits which are not previously monetizable. So for example, if you cap and trade system on CO2 emissions, it places a value on reducing CO2 emissions. So if you have, for example, the RED system for forest conservation, then it monetizes reducing CO2 emissions from forest destruction. Cap and trade on biodiversity could monetize reductions in biodiversity loss. And that could then become a tradable asset. You have to think about the details very carefully, obviously, and nobody's actually done this yet. There's no concrete proposal now. Oh, you have, great, wonderful, I'd like to hear about it.
No, I was just going to say, I'd love to chip in if I have an opportunity.
Sure,
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, Jeffrey.
No, I just said one more thing. A couple of people asked about measuring GDP, and Barry mentioned this in his introductory remarks. The OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, came out with a proposal a couple of years ago with alternatives to GDP and ways of amending GDP to capture the kind of things we're talking about here. And several European countries are actually in the process of implementing that right now. Both Germany and Italy are altering the way they measure GDP in order to make it reflect environmental impacts and environmental values much more. And I'm sure Barry could lead on that one when there's a next Labour government in the UK.
There's a challenge for you, Barry.
Can I comment?
Simon, did you want to just comment on?
Very briefly, all absolutely supportive. So firstly, on the GDP side, I think there's a 25-year history of adjusting GDP, as you know, redefining progress and many other initiatives. I think what's interesting for me is the balance sheet side. So Michael Spence, Nobel Prize winner, in growth economics, who I'm sure, Jeffrey, his argument consistently has been, the problem with growth theory is that there's no balance sheet. Yeah, and he includes environmental and social issues in that. And I think similarly, my commentary about sovereign debt, but really at the core of it is about bringing balance sheets to bear. And I think there are, a series of new opportunities, not necessarily to do that, in the sort of the apex area immediately, but in really important marketplaces and policy domains to make that happen more effectively. And then just briefly on the cap and trade side, if I can sort of generalize the point, I think there are a new set of opportunities emerging to financialize aspects of biodiversity. And I'm using the word deliberately, knowing that it's a provocation because of all of the negative connotations associated with creating markets for biodiversity that subsequently spin out of control. But I do think we can see that big data, AI, aspects of fintech are beginning to open up a new arena for trying to build more effective markets that manage biodiversity and the valuation aspects of them effectively. I think the cap and trade side works more effectively, frankly, if at all, where you have a strong unitary currency, such as carbon tons. I think thinking about digital innovation in the way in which more distributed markets emerge, perhaps will prove to be more effective when we're talking about biodiversity, which in its nature is not, excuse the pun, is not really subject to such a unitary system. So I'm completely in agreement with you that that's a direction to go. But I think there are a new set of instruments that we can use that weren't available when we all started thinking about, for example, cap and trade.
Yep, I quite agree.
Okay, I realize that we're just about on the hour, so I want to take one more question. And and I want a one-sentence answer from each of our panelists before we close. So here's a challenge. So here's a question. It's a bit of a political question. How do we quickly, and it's from Laurie Sinsley, how do we quickly and effectively educate US congressional leaders, and I think we can add other countries' leaders, to understand this and invest more money to address this, the biodiversity crisis? So one sentence answer. Let's start with Barry, alphabetical again.
You've got to make it important for their re-election. I'm sorry, that's cynical, but unfortunately, I believe it's true. Yep. And that means you have to educate the public so that they demand it from their legislators. Not one sentence, but it's as compressed as I can get it.
Very good, thank you. Jeffrey.
I was going to say much the same. You have to emphasize to their constituents that their lives depend on this, and their children's lives and their grandchildren's lives depend on this. They really do depend on this. And I think post-COVID, we have a better chance of doing that than we did pre-COVID.
Great, thank you. Rose? Sorry, Jeff.
No, it's okay. I hate to say, but I really agree with what Simon said about using fear as a psychological, characteristic of a human being, and really learn the lessons from this current pandemic. And I hope the politicians will learn the lessons and will make better decisions in the future.
Rose, there's nothing quite so much like the fear of not getting re-elected.
Agree.
Okay, Simon.
Yeah, so in the US, we're starting from a fairly low base. So where do we go? I think we've learned from climate that it's a combination of fear, God, and market opportunity. And those three drivers can make together an extraordinary difference in the US.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you very much. I'd just like to say that we've had quite a few questions come in, some of which have been answered online. Those that have not yet been answered, we will be in touch with each of you with an answer from our panel in one way or another. So thank you to everyone who's contributed questions. So sadly, we're out of time. I feel like we could have gone on for another hour at least, and then potentially set up a whole series of webinars on the many of the issues that have been raised today. But I'd like to say a huge thank you to our panel today, who have been excellent, and to our audience too, who've contributed a lot through their comments and questions. I think it's been a very rich, stimulating and thought-provoking discussion. And the insights that we've been given have enlightened us about the scale of the risks we face and the challenges that we face in dealing with these risks. So I think just to say that I think this topic has to be continue to be moving up the agenda. It's very important right now during the COVID crisis that we do consider this. And I think that's one reason why the Paulson Institute has been spearheading this report, which Rose mentioned, on biodiversity financing, which will be launched in mid-September. And the report examines the economic case for investing in nature. It looks at what we call the biodiversity funding gap. So the gap between what's spent now on biodiversity and what needs to be spent to protect our most important biodiversity and ecosystem services. And it identifies mechanisms that, if scaled up, have the potential to close that gap. So it's our hope that that report will be a stepping stone towards more enlightened government policy making to meet these significant but ultimately manageable challenges. So I think I'll leave it there, and just to say thank you to everyone again for the contributions today. And if you'd like to keep up to date with the Paulson Institute's work in this area, please do visit paulsoninstitute.org and follow us on Twitter at PaulsonInst, INST. So thank you very much.
And thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.